Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephan Galpin and this is a show where we're going to put our property experts to task answering your questions. Joining me today is Carly Jermyn, who is CEO and Solicitor at Woodstock Legal Services, Residential and Tenant Law Specialist. Welcome to you, Carly, again. And Zee Razaq, CEO of Certax, Property Taxation Specialist. Welcome to you, Zee.
Hi, Stephen.
Now, we've got 4 questions for you in the show, and we're going to start off with Zee. Why is it interest rates applied to mortgages rise instantly as and when the base rate increases, and yet it takes months to reverse when the base rate reduction is applied?
You're going to get me start defending the banks here, it sounds
yeah,
like.
I think so.
To be fair, I think people don't really realise the timing lagging effect of when rates change. It's because when rates change to increase, it's the cost of borrowing, because that's what it ultimately is what are they getting debt for? And there's also always a lag. So people are very conservative, and when prices increase, they reflect them very quickly. But when prices drop, it's whoever first has the guts, as you'll notice with the banks, to cut the price of lending, i.e. the interest rate. And that sometimes takes time because they may have bought debt at a higher cost and they have to get rid of the debt that they've already bought, because that is what they're ultimately using to lend.
So they're lending what they've already bought?
Of course,
okay.
And that timing effect, and when things change rapidly, and this is what's been happening, is causing banks a lot of problem because they forecast, because they have something called the balance sheet, and they have to manage their cash liquidity, and they have to forecast so many months ahead. And if they bought loads of debt at a higher rate and they weren't anticipating it to drop, then it comes down to the individual banking institution on what debt they've already got on the books to lend, because ultimately that's what they're doing. And they make a margin, just like we do if you're investing in property.
Sure.
You make a margin on what rent you charge to the cost of actually running the business, like mortgage, interest and everything else. So without defending the banks, I think that's what happens. But then it comes down to being a savvy investor to look in the market, get a good mortgage broker, look in the market and see who's lending the money at the most cost-effective rate. And that's why there's a variation. And you'll see that with banking institutions.
But to stop hardship in that area, do you think it's an idea? I mean, I've heard over the years many times the argument whether residential property lending for homes and make that distinction between homes and investment, should perhaps lending for homes be divorced from base rate? Does it have to just track it so finitely?
I think it comes down to whether we want the private sector or do you want the public sector to be doing this? Because if you want the private sector, no one's going to give you something at a loss, are they? Logically, if that's what you're
no,
proposing.
But if, for instance, a building society could borrow 30-year money, couldn't it? For instance, so irrespective of whatever happened to the base rate during that period, that they can still lend at a rate. Now that might be slightly higher than 1 over base or something like that, or the silly situation I got into a few years ago when I had a tracker mortgage in 2008, and it went so low that it was 2% I think above base, and it ended up that it went so low that they were paying me. I was getting a check every month.
Wow.
I mean, we've been in these sort of silly circumstances, and I just go back to that and think, well, if it had been specific home lending that they'd borrowed, that they were lending, then you wouldn't need this fear that keeps going into, especially young homeowners. They're terrified at the moment of what's happening. I mean, they're thinking that 4.5%. Oh, what am I going to do? I mean, when I was buying my first house, I think it was 10 or 12%, and it went up to 15%. So they haven't seen nothing yet.
I think that one of the key things is the central banks, right? And that's what you're talking about, the base rate, is what rate are they providing to the retail banks? Because that is ultimately what's driving all this. And the debate is whether from a social perspective, a social justice perspective, whether they should be subsidized by the government. I think that's the only way, because if you're a private enterprise, you're never going to sell, or very rarely, if you want to stay in business, you're going to sell something that's going to make you a loss. And there's a big challenge, because holding money, liquidity, there's so much criteria for the banking sector. There's a cost of holding money as well.
Well, I appreciate that, but you know, if you're a shopkeeper, you buy stock, don't you? You put it on your shelf and you sell it over a period of time. So I can't see why a house lender, for instance, can't buy some, even if it's 5-year money, put it on the shelf and say, well, I'm fixed at 5, so now anybody that comes to me for a mortgage, I'm going to charge them 7, and I'm going to charge them 7 on all that money until it's gone. Am I being too simplistic?
I think you are, and I would explain this in the way. It's a really good example.
Not for the first time. See,
the reason being is something called liquidity, and this is what, especially with Basel and all this liquidity reform that happened in the banking sector, they have to get evaluated on a daily basis. A lot of these banks, right? So it's not simple of holding like the stock in it whenever I sell
That's
it.
their stress test.
Exactly, and
Right,
they've been, especially 2008 when they got bailed out, the criteria got more rigorous. And you think about even a percentage point, they do it base points, bips they call it. That's a big difference, isn't it? And even one change in that affects their profitability, and they have to speak to shareholders. So not to defend them, this is what happens when you got the private sector. It's not perfect.
But you see, going back to all that trouble of the sort of 2008 to 10s, I suppose, I mean, that was because, I mean, it wasn't our fault, was it? It wasn't our kids having 100% mortgages that caused the problem. It was these people in America that were packaging up all these portfolios, getting them to be as expansive as they could, lending to anybody that would sign the bit of paper, and then flogging the portfolio. That was the downfall of it all, wasn't it?
That was one of them, the derivatives that you're talking about. But the issue in the UK, I think everyone forgets Northern Rock and all the rest of the stuff. So we did quite a lot as well. It wasn't just the States. We were doing 120% mortgages. And I think that was obviously not sustainable as soon as the price drops. So I think we always look at others. We sometimes have to look at ourselves. There's not a perfect situation, but there's always a cost if you subsidize something. And
see, I always thought with that business of you know, selling on the portfolios of debt, you're asking for trouble, because these people are going to try and bolster up those portfolios to get the most. And I thought the simplest way of getting around that and to ensure good, sensible lending was to say, if you lend money to somebody for 25 years, then you've got it for 25 years. You know, that sorts some of the banks out. You know, there's no flogging it, there's no passing it on, or, you know, subselling it. You know, if you're lending for 25 years, unless your borrower wants to cash it in and move on and move upwards, then that's what you're stuck with, mate.
I think this goes back to our friend Tony Blair, if without mentioning names, when his government came in Labour in the 1990s, and they promoted derivatives, and that had a boost to London. So whether that's right or wrong, it's a different conversation. But there is a challenge when you do things like this, because ultimately, if you sell debt, no one knows what the original debt is until it defaults.
Right. Well, we'd better ask Carly a question. Here we go. Can the panel give their opinion on the prospects of cryptocurrency becoming a strong feature of property purchase? My understanding in the past is that a number of solicitors have expressed worries about confirming the provenance of funds using this method of payment, which would then cause difficulties under money laundering regulations. Is that right?
Yeah, it's coming, isn't it? I think, you know, look at 3 trillion it's worth, isn't it? Cryptocurrency, 10,000 different ones. But yeah, I think in the legal profession, there's a bit of a fear around it. And I think because we are so highly regulated, huge obligation on us when it comes to money laundering, and, you know, checking the source of funds, and it's the unknown, isn't it? And it's also the concern of the links with cryptocurrency and criminal activity, the misuse of funds. And I don't think, you know, the view is the SRA haven't yet been particularly supportive in giving us the rules and guidance to allow us to, you know, progress. Lawyers love rules, don't they? So, you know, we need the SRA really to step up and start giving us some guidance on it. So I think we're a little bit, you know, we're a bit far off, but it's coming. And I think law firms are going to have to try and push with the SRA to make sure we do get that guidance, so we can really start to accommodate.
The Bank of England announced the other day they were going to launch their own cryptocurrency, didn't they, which was asset backed with the pound.
Yeah.
Is that going to crash the crypto market?
I'd have to we need a crypto specialist, don't we? Yeah.
just
Come on
a bit
then, you.
insight.
Yeah, that's
we do see a bit of different. The thing is understanding what the different types of crypto income is.
Complex.
And this is where it gets really crazy because there's a huge tax implication. We have a similar issue from what you have is identifying source and then what type of income it is. Because you've got just a crypto investor who is looking for a capital gain ultimately. But then there's something called staking, which is dealt like trading as income. And this is becoming quite prevalent. I don't know if you've come across with this. It's quite a lot now. And I'm seeing where people are investing in these new types of crypto. And that's subject to income tax or corporation if it's the company. It's not a capital gain. And it's making sure that you get the right information. And that is quite hard to identify source of funds to because they're investing in a crypto and getting rewards. So they're getting money from investing rather than something's gone up or down. So that's why it gets a bit scary.
Am I right? My very simple and basic understanding of these matters, see, but am I right to think that whilst you make money on cryptocurrency, with it fluctuating or whichever way, that's not taxable? But it's when you take it out of cryptocurrency and put it into pounds or something tangible that then it becomes taxable. Is that right?
Just to caveat, that's pretty close. What happens is that when you sell crypto, dealt like shares, the same rule. And there's a whole debate why it should be because it's supposed to be money. But what happens is as soon as you sell that crypto, if you buy another crypto or cash out, that's considered a taxable event. If you swap between cryptos, that's also a taxable event. And that's the one that gets people confused. So if you've gone from Bitcoin to Ethereum, and things like this, you suddenly got a taxable event happened and you may not even have the money.
Well, I think there's a lot of people in the world who are going to fall foul of this, aren't there?
It's the unknown.
Absolutely, and I think you're going to have it when people come to buy property. And
buying properties, and as a litigator, it dawned on me when we were talking about, looking at enforcing debts as well. When do we start looking at crypto as a means to recover that debt from a debtor? That'll be interesting. First one to do.
On that note, that's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break when we'll be asking Zee and Carly more of your questions. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephan Galpin and I'm joined by Carly Jermyn and Zee Razaq. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And Zee, your question in this half is this. Do those that provide finance for property purchase, i.e. banks or brokers, receive any direct pressure from the government or other authorities in terms of encouraging or discouraging lending? And in particular, the criteria for doing so. And again, you've got a lot of developer clients. I'm just wondering whether they're suffering from what I would call government interference into the markets, but you might want to put it more politely, I don't know.
I think it's quite an interesting area because there's the direct or indirect. So indirect, I would say, is raising interest rates, right? Because the impact is obviously the cost of finance increases and therefore people may not go ahead with projects. So that's indirect. The direct bit is going back to what we were discussing in a previous episode around the 2008 financial crisis, is when they cut down liquidity, i.e. cash, that has a knock-on effect. So if Bank of England, which is obviously what the government used to create money, i.e. money supply, quantity easing, if they have less cash available, then there's less to go around. And this is, I would say, direct impact, because if they do that, then the banks obviously can't then lend because they've got lack of money. And this is what happened in the financial crisis. It was a credit crunch, if you recall. That's right, there's less cash. So if I'm trying to break it down, that's the way the government influence financial institutions, therefore influence like the property market that we obviously concentrate on. So that's the way I would break it down. And it's a really difficult one because to control inflation, it's an economic answer to this, to control inflation, you've got to cut down money supply, don't you? Because you can't have more money and not enough goods and services increasing at the same rate. That's what leads to inflation.
You know, I'm very limited on these subjects, I'm afraid, but it just seems to me that we've now got huge inflation, but it's not being caused by the conventional causes of inflation, is it? It's not caused by people taking out too much credit card debt or, you know, doing other silly things or buying too many motor cars or, you know, holidays abroad or whatever. It's being caused by supply circumstances, in a lot of cases caused by the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion and that sort of thing. So I do just wonder whether just simply putting up interest rates isn't a bit of a blunt instrument, really. Are the bank using the right thing to control what we've got at the moment?
Well, great question, and I think we went into detail when we talked about the winter statement. So if anyone who hasn't watched the winter statement episode, we went into real good detail. There's a number of factors. I think we mentioned 4 factors, if I recall, on that. One was what we just mentioned about them printing money, causing problems, because if you print loads of money and you don't have more goods and services, obviously they're going to go up in price, aren't they? And that's happened. Number 2, the dreaded B, and I've got a lot of stick for that, about Brexit. Number 3 is obviously the Ukraine war has definitely affected. And number 4, COVID. When you compound all of these, it's causing a lot of problems. So when they're trying to do interest rates, they are trying to use a tool, as you rightly said, which is not probably the right tool for the current economic circumstances, because we've got supply side pressures. They need to increase goods and services, not just increase interest rates. And I think you've made a fantastic point that that's not having the desired effect like it's done historically. They used to increase interest rates to control inflation. But as you rightly said, people are borrowing and the money issues are different in the current economic climate.
I think we are in very complex times at the moment. I mean, I've got to say, I voted for Brexit because I thought it would shake the country up and just energise the country into wanting to do more around the world. I thought that might be quite good. And I thought at the time that, our blonde-haired leader at the time might sort of carry on that sort of ethos. Not to be, though. And I mean, actually, I was listening to somebody on the radio the other day and they said, well, hold on a minute. You ditch your biggest trading partner, you fall out with your neighbours. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's not going to cost you money? And I mean, it's right, isn't it? Yeah. I have yet to see anybody come on the television, on any talk show or news show, and say, actually, that we've actually had a benefit from Brexit. I can't see, and if there is, I can't see what it is.
I think one of the biggest challenges we've got is, and this was flagged at that time, is the skill set within the UK. We have to have a different type of skill set to be able to change our trajectory, to be able to negotiate and see opportunities. If Brexit benefits, which they were claiming, come to light, and I don't think we've got that skill set, because historically for the last 40, 50 years, Europe have been negotiating, not in the UK. So we haven't thought through what skills do we need to change. So it's all good saying from a financial perspective, I'm saying financially, not political, financial perspective, there's going to be benefits. But if we ain't got the skill sets to make those benefits come to light, there isn't benefits, the cost. And that's what's causing us huge problems right now in our economy. But people just put their head in the sand and they start saying you're Europhile, all this. No, we want the best for our economy, for our children and the future. There's a big difference.
Would you go back?
Would I go back? I never voted for it. So I think you do the best for the country, and ultimately we have to respect what everyone as a collective, whether we agree with it or not, we're a democracy, right? So the percentage, whether the majority won, financially it's a car crash.
I think we were a misled democracy. That's the problem. Come on, Carly, what do you think?
My view, I'm a lawyer, so I like to see the cold hard facts. Everybody's presented their case. And I didn't vote because I didn't have the time to sit down and analyse it in the depth that actually is needed to understand the ins and outs of it, the consequences, to be able to cast my opinion, So, but, a lot of people did.
That was very moral of you, wasn't it?
I mean, it's true though, isn't it? It's incredibly complex. You've just sat there and, there's half the stuff you've just said I hadn't even thought about, I consider myself to be fairly well educated, well read. I try my best, but there's a lot of people out there who don't, and did cast a vote. And it's complex. You've got to really, get to grips with the detail of it and how it all works in the bigger picture. So
right, Carly. I know this subject has been discussed on your show previously, but I can't think of a better time to switch stamp duty liability to a vendor rather than the purchaser. This would help so many people, first-time buyers, those using upsizing or downsizing, and would allow funding for the full cost of any purchase. What do the panel think?
Can't imagine it being a popular change. I can see the logic in that it would help, people moving upward the property ladder and free up property below. Personally, I'd be great. We've bought a property, it's gone up in value and you're stuck because it's gone up in value so much in that particular area that you're a little bit stuck. You're really difficult and expensive to even make a sideways move, let alone move on to your next property. So, I understand in theory the logic behind it, but you've got to consider that vendors are already paying agents' fees, capital gains tax if they're an investor. I can't see it being particularly popular, and I think all that would happen is a vendor's going to build that cost into the price.
But it's fundable at that point, isn't it?
True, it's true. Yeah.
And what's the difficulty with the housing market at the moment that young people would tell you about is that they can't afford the deposits, because not only have they got to find a deposit, they've got to find X amount of thousands of pounds stamp duty.
But isn't that where the relief should be?
Well, it is, but that means other taxpayers are paying for them to.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's and it's keeping all the people happy all of the time, isn't it? And it's really difficult. I can't see them doing it. Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Zee?
Crazy question for me, and I think Carly's answered it extremely well around capital gains tax. You couldn't have stamp duty and capital gains tax for the same person. That just sounds like madness. Because because remember, when you buy it, you pay stamp duty, and when
I've got your answer to that one. It's easy, because what you would do is somebody has paid stamp duty going in, you'd allow a credit of that amount against the stamp duty that you've got to pay on exit. And I don't know what the figures would be, but I imagine that if most people selling their houses in the private sector, and I'm not talking about investment ones, but just private homes, most people have made a profit. That's why they're selling, to either use that profit to downsize and not have a mortgage, or upsize and have something better. So they're making a profit. We already allow that to be tax-free if it's your home. You see, I'm not sure that that's that sustainable. I don't see. I know it wouldn't be very popular, but I don't.
Turn the camera up.
I think if you make a profit, you make a profit and you pay tax on it.
But it's all relative, isn't it? It's all relative. It's not as though, you've still got to have somewhere to live, and you've still got to continue, and you need people to continue moving.
I think this is a quite interesting. Stephen's raised proper controversial debate. I think on your main home, that's one of our biggest privileges. Let's not start. Is there anything going to be left? We're going to have anyone left in the country after this if we start doing this stuff, because how are you going to administer people? Common question, capital gains tax, I don't understand it. That's a common question, especially in tax season that we just went through, especially when you start talking about their main house, and there's loads of complexities around that. It's not always the case that you don't pay tax on your main house, by the way.
Well, I'm going back to question one, give it land registry to sort out.
I think it'd be, and I think for our professions, it'd be quite difficult, because you have the legal person who obviously administers and helps support the conveyancing and has to have some understanding of stamp duty. Then you've got your tax advisor, accountant, if you're a investor or need advice. For all these people to then be able to explain to a lay person, especially a change like this and that crossover, I think that would be quite challenging, I would say. I think that would require
I think the pair of you have got no nerve. That's what I think.
An option to pay it over time as well.
Why? You're getting the funds for your house that you're selling?
60 days at the moment, capital gains tax.
Right. Well, on that note of discord, that's all we have time for today. So, Carly Jermyn and Zee Razaq, thank you both very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, you've done very well. Great answers. Thank you so much. I'm Stephan Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.